So in Genesis chapter 22, the Bible tells us a story about a man named Abraham who had one and only son named Isaac. And God had already promised Abraham that through his son Isaac, God was going to make Abraham into a great nation. And later we find out in the Bible that that nation is the nation of Israel. But anyway, God comes to Abraham and he says, Abraham, and Abraham says, here I am. He says, I want you to go offer me a burnt sacrifice. Now, he's done this many times. They take a lamb, normally the best lamb they've got, and then they build an altar with wood and they set a fire under it. And then they sacrifice that lamb, which had great value, and they would place that lamb on the offering, and then they would burn that lamb, and that offering would go up to God. And it was a way of worshiping God in the Old Testament. This was before the Ten Commandments. This was before the nation of Israel ever came into being. And so Abraham was aware. In fact, Isaac was aware of what this would look like. And he says, but this time God says to Abraham, I want you to sacrifice your son, Isaac, on the altar. Well, how could that happen and Isaac still be, first off, why would God even ask that? But he is God and Abraham was obedient. And Abraham took Isaac and two servants and he split some wood and he put the wood on the donkeys, and Abraham, Isaac, two of his servants and the donkey with the wood, they all take a 3 days journey to a land called Moriah. And so they're on their way to this mountain area. And when they get really close, Abraham looks up and God speaks to him somehow and says, there, that's where you're going to worship me. So he says to his two servants, he says, all right, you two men, you stay here, and me and the boy, we're going to go worship on that mountain, and then we are going to come back to you. Now, the Bible tells us in another place that Abraham believed that if he obeyed God, that God was going to raise up Isaac from the dead, because the promise was through Isaac that he was going to be a great nation, and Abraham believed God. And so this was actually a test by God to Abraham. God never intended for him to kill his son. That was never the intention. But he says, all right. And so Isaac and Abraham, the Bible tells us that Abraham takes the wood off the donkey and he places it on the back of his son Isaac. And then he takes the knife and he puts it in his sheath, and he takes the fire, whatever that looked like, whether that be a box that they used to create fire with. And they start on their journey up to that mountain. On the way, Isaac looks at his dad and says, Father, yes, son, I've got the wood and you got the knife and the fire, but where's the sacrifice? Where's the lamb? And Abraham looks at his son seriously and says, God will provide the sacrifice, son. Well, at this point, you know that Isaac knew something weird was happening. And they get to the top of the mountain of Mount Moriah, where God showed Abraham exactly where he wanted him to sacrifice his son. And they get to that mountain, and he arranges the wood, and he builds the altar, and he creates the fire, but he doesn't light it. And he sits over there. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us this part, but I imagine he's sitting here just sharpening his knife, because if he has to do this thing, he wants to make sure it's done quick. Sharpening his knife, and I imagine that his son looks at him and says, Dad, what's wrong? And his dad looks at him and he says, Isaac, I love you. I know that, Dad. I want you to trust me. I trust you, Dad. Come here, son. Isaac comes over to his dad. Turn around, son. He ties him up. He lays him up on the altar. Dad, what are you doing? And he puts him on that wood. Oh, Dad, I know what you're doing. He takes out the knife and he pulls up the knife and he's going to kill his son. But right before he drives the knife into his boy, the Bible says that the angel of the Lord shouts at Abraham from heaven and says, Abraham, Abraham, stop. Now I know you fear me. Now I know you believe. And then instantly Abraham looks, and there on the mountain, caught in his horns, was a ram. And he took that ram and he sacrificed that ram in place of his son. And the Bible tells us that because Abraham believed God, it was credited to him as righteousness. In other words, all of Abraham's sin, all of his disobedience, all of his guilt, everything that, his sin that was counted against him, Abraham, was taken away. Not because Abraham became perfect, not because Abraham stopped sinning and started becoming obedient, but because Abraham believed God. Period. And that's called faith.